Have you ever had a gut feeling so strong, so undeniable, that you just couldn't shake it off? A strange intuition that made no logical sense at the time, until reality proved you right? Some people call it the sixth sense, others call it instinct. But whatever it is, it has saved lives, prevented disasters, and left many questioning just how much we really understand about human perception. Today, we're diving into 28 real-life stories from Reddit, where gut feelings turned out to be eerily accurate. From near-miss kidnappings to last-minute decisions that avoided fatal accidents, these stories will make you wonder, do we all have an internal alarm system that we should trust more? And trust me, by the end of this video, you might just start listening to your instincts a little more closely. Before we jump in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the craziest real-life stories from Reddit True Vault. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, leave a like and share your own experiences in the comments below. Now, let's get started, starting with a story where a four-legged friend turned out to be a true lifesaver. Story number 1. Max, the guardian angel in fur. The narrator of this story, Laura. When I first moved onto a military base with my husband, I had no idea my biggest protector would come in the form of a 75-pound fur missile named Max. He was a husky German shepherd mixed with the instincts of a detective and the loyalty of a soldier. One quiet afternoon, while I was home alone, a loud knock rattled my front door. Standing outside was a man in his mid-40s, greasy hair, stained work clothes, and an overall sketchy vibe. He claimed to be from maintenance, sent to install an attic fan. Something felt wrong. He had no uniform, no work ID, and most importantly, no tools. I hesitated, my hand still on the door handle, when suddenly, Max stepped forward. His ears perked up, his entire body tensed, and a low, rumbling growl vibrated through his chest. That was my first clue that this wasn't just my paranoia. The man must have noticed my hesitation because he suddenly yanked at the screen door, trying to force it open. Big mistake. Max exploded. He lunged forward, teeth bared, barking so ferociously that I felt the sound in my ribcage. The man practically jumped backward, nearly tripping over himself as he stumbled off the porch. He muttered a curse under his breath before power walking away like he had somewhere very urgent to be. My heart was racing, but my instincts kicked in. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and ran to secure the back entrance. Then, I called the military police. When they arrived, they checked the records. No attic fan installations were scheduled in our area for another 2 weeks. That man had no reason to be there. A few weeks later, the real maintenance crew showed up, clean uniforms, proper work orders, professional attitudes. They knocked, introduced themselves, and even before I could check their IDs, Max took one look at them and wagged his tail. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what his intentions were, but I know this. Max wasn't just a pet. That day, he was my guardian angel in fur. But not everyone has a fearless protector like Max. Sometimes, all you have is your own instincts, and that can be just as powerful. Let's move on to the next story. Story number 2. The night I disappeared. The narrator of this story, Nathan. I've always thought of myself as a logical person. I don't believe in ghosts, omens, or any of that trust your gut nonsense. But that night changed everything. It was around 2 a.m., and I was walking home from Jake's place. We had just finished watching some old horror flicks, the kind where the protagonist always makes the dumbest decisions. I remember laughing, saying, "Who the hell would ever just stand there when something feels off?" Irony's a funny thing. I was halfway home when I noticed the truck. An old, rusted pickup, rolling way too slow for my liking. At first, I told myself to relax. Maybe they were just looking for an address. Then I saw them, 2 guys in the cab, 2 more sitting in the truck bed. None of them talking, just staring. Every cell in my body screamed at me to move. I didn't stop to think. I just acted. There was a thick hedge in someone's front yard, and before I even knew what I was doing, I dove behind it, pressing myself as low as I could. Leaves scratched my face. My pulse hammered in my ears. The truck circled back. "Where the hell did he go?" one of them muttered. "I don't know. He was right here." I didn't move, didn't breathe. For a full minute, they just sat there, engine idling. Then, finally, they rolled forward and disappeared into the night. I stayed hidden long after they were gone, just in case. When I finally ran home, slammed the door, and locked every single bolt, I sank to the floor, shaking. I didn't know who they were. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew, deep in my bones, that if I hadn't trusted that one split-second feeling, I wouldn't be telling this story today. But what if you know you're being followed and you have nowhere to run? That's exactly what happened to the next person in our story. Story number 3, Three Strangers Following in the Night. The narrator of this story, Jason. New Orleans at 2:15 a.m. is a strange place. The streets are never completely deserted, but there's an eerie quiet, like the whole city is holding its breath. The occasional honk of a distant car, the faint sound of a saxophone from a late-night jazz bar, the rhythmic tap-tap-tap of my sneakers against the pavement. That night, my footsteps weren't the only ones. I had just finished my shift at a downtown restaurant. The bus had dropped me off a few blocks from my apartment, and I was walking the last stretch home when I noticed them. 3 men, maybe late 20s, dressed casually but moving too deliberately. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. But then I tested it. I slowed down. They slowed down. I sped up. They sped up. My stomach clenched. My apartment was just up ahead, a small duplex with a porch and a flimsy wooden gate. I stepped onto my walkway, trying to keep my pace normal. My hands reached into my pocket, fingers brushing against my keys. I felt metal, grabbed one, shoved it into the lock. Wrong key. My breath hitched. I could hear footsteps on the gravel behind me. I forced myself to stay calm, fumbling for another key. I could feel them now, standing at the gate, hesitating for just a second before stepping inside. The second key slid in. I twisted. The lock clicked. I yanked the door open, slipped inside, and slammed it shut. My shaking fingers locked the deadbolt. Through the peephole, I saw them standing there, talking, deciding something. After a moment, they turned and walked away. I never saw them again. And I never walked home alone that late again. But sometimes, your gut doesn't warn you about strangers. It warns you about someone already in your life. Story number 4, Staying Cautious Around Family. The narrator of this story, Lauren. When I was a kid, there was one person in my family who always made my skin crawl. My Uncle Dave. To everyone else, he was just another guy at family gatherings. He smiled, told bad dad jokes, and always brought some generic grocery store cookies to share. But to me, something was off. I never had a concrete reason. He never did anything overtly wrong, never said anything that set off alarms. But whenever he was around, my stomach would tighten. I would find reasons to leave the room or stay near my parents. If he offered a hug, I'd pretend I didn't hear him and rush off. The feeling wasn't fear exactly, more like an overwhelming urge to not be alone with him. Everyone in my family thought I was just being shy. "Oh, Lauren's always been a little standoffish," they'd laugh. I started to believe I was just being paranoid. Years passed. I grew up, moved out, and barely thought about Uncle Dave. Then, one evening, I got a call from my mom. Her voice was shaking. Dave had been arrested. Turns out, he had been hurting his own daughter for years. The police had enough evidence to put him away for a long time. The moment I heard the news, that old, sickening feeling in my stomach returned. I knew. I had always known. I wish I had been wrong. I wish my gut had lied to me. But it didn't. And I hate that it was right. But sometimes, your gut feeling doesn't just warn you. It helps you save someone else before it's too late. Story number 5, A Gut Feeling at the Parking Lot. The narrator of this story, Rachel. I don't consider myself paranoid. If anything, I've always been the kind of person who rolls my eyes at those crime show narrators saying, she had a gut feeling something was wrong. And she was right. Yeah, okay, sure. But then one night, in a nearly empty parking lot, I had that feeling. And let me tell you, I listened. It started the second I stepped out of the grocery store. My car was only a few rows away, but as I walked toward it, I noticed 2 men. One leaning against a tree, the other standing next to the car parked right beside mine. No shopping bags, no phones out, just standing there and looking at me. My brain immediately went into overdrive. Maybe they're just waiting for someone. Maybe I'm overthinking this. But as soon as I took a step forward, the man against the tree straightened. The other shifted slightly, angling himself toward me. I froze. Everything in me screamed, "Turn around. Now." So I did. I spun on my heel, walked straight back into the store, and went up to the customer service desk like I totally meant to do that. "Hey, could someone walk me to my car?" I let out a nervous laugh. I know it's probably nothing, but the cashier, Ethan, bless him, nodded and grabbed his vest. "Yeah, no problem." We stepped outside together. The 2 men, gone, vanished. I stood there, gripping my keys, stomach twisting. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe they really were waiting for someone, and I just made a fool of myself. Or maybe I had just avoided something very bad. Sometimes, stepping back can save your life. But what happens when your gut tells you something you can't change? Story number 6. Something was wrong. A nurse's intuition. The narrator of this story, William. I've been a nurse in the ER for almost a decade. I've seen everything from paper cuts that people swear are fatal to actual life or death emergencies. But there's one thing I've learned to trust more than anything else: my gut. That night, I was midway through a long shift when a man walked in, clutching his chest. Mid-40s, relatively healthy looking, but something about him set off alarm bells in my head. We ran an EKG, perfectly normal. No irregularities, no immediate signs of a heart attack. The doctor wasn't concerned, but I was. There was something in the way he looked, his skin slightly clammy, his breathing just a little off. He wasn't panicked, but he was uneasy, like he could feel something coming but didn't know how to explain it. So, I made a decision. Instead of sending him back to the waiting area like usual, I asked him to stay right where he was. I grabbed a blood pressure cuff and started chatting with him, keeping him engaged while casually keeping an eye on his vitals. And then it happened. 1 second, he was answering my question about his job. The next, his eyes rolled back, and his entire body slumped forward. Cardiac arrest. Right there, in the middle of the ER waiting room, we launched into full code blue mode. Chest compressions, defibrillator, everything. But despite our best efforts, he didn't make it. I still think about him sometimes. What if I had pushed harder for additional tests? What if he had come in just 10 minutes earlier? What if ill? But the biggest takeaway? When your gut screams that something is wrong, listen. Not just doctors or nurses, sometimes an ordinary person's intuition is the only thing keeping them safe. Like the college student who trusted her gut and avoided a break-in. Story number 7. The fake security system installer. The narrator of this story, Sarah. I was home alone that evening, enjoying the rare silence of my apartment. My roommate was out of town for the weekend, and I had been looking forward to 2 days of peace until the knock at the door. It was sharp, too forceful. Like whoever was on the other side expected me to open up without hesitation. I froze for a second, then quietly made my way to the peephole. A man stood outside, middle-aged, rough-looking. He wore an old work jacket and jeans, but no uniform, no ID badge. Something didn't feel right. I cracked the door open just an inch, fingers tight on the chain lock. "Yeah, hey there," the man said, forcing a smile. "I'm here to install the new security system for this unit." Security system? That was news to me. A slow, uneasy weight settled in my chest. I glanced at his hands. No toolbox, no equipment, just shoved deep into his pockets like he had all the time in the world. "Oh," I said, keeping my tone casual, like I wasn't already reaching for an excuse. "My roommate actually set that up. She's in the bedroom right now, but she can take care of it later." His smile twitched. "Not gone, but different." "It won't take long," he said, stepping just a little closer. "I just need to do a quick check." Every alarm in my body went off at once. I shifted, just enough to make it seem like I was turning back toward the apartment. Instead, my foot nudged the door, just an inch, just enough to remind him of the chain lock. "She's asleep," I lied smoothly. "I wouldn't want to wake her up. Maybe you can come back later." Silence. A few seconds stretched way too long. Then, finally, he exhaled, shrugged like he hadn't just been staring through the gap in the door, and turned away. I didn't move until I heard his footsteps fade down the hall. Then the door was shut, deadbolt locked, chain secured, and I was already reaching for my phone. The next morning, I asked the building manager about the installation. Their blank stare told me everything I needed to know. There's no security upgrade scheduled for any of the units. A chill ran down my spine. There's nothing wrong with trusting your gut, especially when it might be the only thing standing between you and something much worse. But sometimes, gut feelings don't just protect you. They might be the only thing standing between you and something much worse. Story number 8. The 1 second that saved my life. The narrator of this story, Jake. Traffic was light that night, and I was in a good mood. My favorite song was playing, and the streets were empty enough that I barely had to tap the brakes. As I approached the intersection, the traffic light ahead flicked from red to green. No cars in sight. Normally, I would have just driven through without a second thought. But some weird, nagging feeling in the back of my mind made me hesitate. I can't explain it. It wasn't fear exactly. More like an invisible hand pressing against my chest, whispering, "Wait." So, instead of hitting the gas, I eased up. And that's when a massive semi-truck blew through the red light at full speed. It roared past, so close I could feel the air shift. If I had gone even a second earlier, I would have been nothing but metal scraps on the pavement. I sat there, heart hammering, fingers clenched so tight around the steering wheel that they ached. The light was still green. My turn to go, but for a solid 10 seconds, I couldn't move. Eventually, I let out a shaky breath and pressed forward, every nerve in my body still buzzing. I made it home that night, but the thought wouldn't leave me. If I had ignored that feeling, if I had chalked it up to paranoia, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Sometimes, slowing down for just 1 second can save your whole life. But what if your gut tells you that someone you trust is actually someone to fear? Story number 9, the boyfriend's creepy friend. The narrator of this story, Natalia. From the moment I met Travis, I knew something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it. He never did anything outright threatening. He was just wrong. The way he looked at people, the way he carried himself, like he was always calculating something. He and my boyfriend, Samuel, played Xbox together a lot. Travis would come over, plop down on our couch, and spin these ridiculous stories about bar fights, shady deals, even run-ins with the police. None of it ever felt real, but the way he told them, like he was reliving it, like he wished it were real. I hated the way he looked at me, too. Not in a flirty way, no. This was worse. His gaze felt mean, cold, like he was dissecting me, seeing how I'd react to the things he said. I told Samuel, there's something wrong with that guy. I don't trust him. Samuel laughed it off. He thought I was overreacting, said Travis was just a little weird, but harmless. Over time, Samuel stopped hanging out with him as much. Maybe he picked up on the same unease I felt. Maybe it was just life pulling them apart. Either way, I was relieved when Travis stopped coming around. Then, years later, Samuel got a call. Dude, Travis is dead. Cops shot him after he killed his wife and his neighbor. I felt sick. I had felt it all along. The tension in my gut, the instinct that screamed stay away from him. And I was right. I turned to Samuel, but he wouldn't look at me. Maybe he was remembering all the times I warned him. Maybe he was realizing that sometimes gut feelings aren't paranoia. They're survival instincts. But not everyone gets the chance to listen to them unless someone steps in at the right time. Story number 10, the stranger on the train. The narrator of this story, eerily. Seoul's subway system is one of the safest in the world. At least, that's what I used to believe. That night, I was on my usual ride home after work. It was late, and the train was mostly quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every little thing stand out. That's when I saw her, Mia, a foreigner, sitting near the doors. She had that stiff, polite smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. And then I saw him, a man standing way too close behind her, gripping the overhead handrail, but never looking up. His eyes were locked on her, calculating, predatory. Every time she shifted, so did he. When she crossed her arms, he inched closer. When she tensed up, he smiled. Something in my gut twisted. I had no idea who she was, but I knew one thing. She needed an out. So, I walked right up to her, smiled like we were old friends, and said, Mia, there you are, ready to go. She looked at me, wide-eyed, a little confused. Then I saw the moment she understood. Yes. Thank you for waiting. I casually reached out, took her arm, and we walked off the train together. I could feel the man's eyes burning into my back as the doors shut behind us. We ducked into a nearby cafe, and she let out a shaky breath. That guy followed me off the last train. He's been watching me for 10 minutes. I didn't know what he wanted, but I knew it wasn't anything good. Sometimes, you don't need to be a hero. You just need to be someone who notices. But then, there are times when a gut feeling doesn't just warn you about danger. It prepares you for the inevitable. Story number 11, the Final Goodnight. The narrator of this story, Oliver. Some moments stay with you forever, not because they were loud or dramatic, but because of how quiet they were. My mom, Eleanor, had been fighting stage 4 cancer for years. She was tough, tougher than anyone I knew. She smiled through the chemo, cracked jokes in hospital beds, and made sure I never saw how much pain she was in. But deep down, I knew. We all did. That night, something felt off. I was up late watching TV, trying to distract myself from the weight of it all. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Then, out of nowhere, my mom appeared. She wasn't supposed to be up. Her body was too weak. But there she was, slowly making her way down the stairs. She didn't say anything. She just sat down next to me on the couch. At first, I thought she wanted to talk, maybe reminisce about old memories or share some last piece of wisdom. But she didn't. She just sat there, quietly, watching the screen but not really watching. I glanced over at her, and in that moment, something deep inside me whispered, "This is it." I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to acknowledge that my mom, the strongest person I'd ever known, was at the end of her road. But my gut knew. So instead of asking if she was okay, Instead of trying to make conversation, I simply said, "Good night, Mom." She turned to me, smiled softly, and responded, "Goodbye, sweetheart." The next morning, my dad woke me up. She was gone. To this day, I don't know how I knew. I don't know what it was in her posture, her silence, or maybe just something in the air that night. But I knew, not all gut feelings are warnings of loss. Sometimes, they're the very thing that saves us from it. Story number 12. The van that never should have been there. The narrator of this story, Eric. When you're a kid, you don't question much. You trust adults. You believe the world is mostly safe, and you assume that if something feels off, it's just your imagination. But sometimes that's not. I was about 7 years old, playing on the front lawn of our house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It was a warm afternoon, and I was lost in my own little world, kicking a soccer ball against the curb, not a care in sight. Then I saw it, a white van, old and a little rusted, rolling slowly down our street. It wasn't the ice cream truck. It wasn't a delivery van. It had no logos, no windows on the sides, just a big, empty-looking cargo van that had no business creeping down our road like that. It came to a stop right in front of my house. The driver, a man probably in his 40s, leaned out the window and smiled. Too friendly, too eager. "Hey, kid," he called, waving me over. I don't remember his exact words. Maybe he said he needed directions. Maybe he had candy. Maybe he was looking for a lost dog. What I do remember, though, is the way my stomach dropped. A cold, slithering feeling ran up my spine, making every part of me scream. No, I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, straight into the house, slamming the door behind me. My mom, startled, asked what was wrong. I told her about the van, about the man, about how something didn't feel right. My dad ran outside, but by then, the van was already gone. For years, I didn't fully understand what had happened that day. Maybe he was just a weird guy. Maybe he really did need directions. Or maybe I was one step away from being a face on a missing child poster. And you know what? I don't care to know the truth. Because I'm sure of one thing, running was the right decision. Sometimes, your gut feeling isn't just a feeling. It's a warning that could save your life. Story number 13. The dog that saw through the mask. The narrator of this story, Samitra. You know how people say, dogs can sense things we can't? I used to roll my eyes at that. Now, I believe it with every fiber of my being. When my mom introduced us to her new boyfriend, Tom, I tried to be supportive. He was charming, polite, maybe a little too polished, but I told myself I was just being overly critical. Mom deserved happiness, and I didn't want to be the overprotective daughter. But Baxter? Baxter wasn't fooled. Baxter, my goofy, lovable Labrador retriever, had never met a person he didn't adore. He greeted everyone with a wagging tail and sloppy kisses, except Tom. The moment Tom stepped into our house, Baxter froze. His fur bristled, his tail went stiff, and then came the growl. It wasn't an aggressive, stay away from my food kind of growl. It was low, warning, almost primal. Tom laughed it off. "Guess I'm just not a dog person," he said with a smirk. But Baxter didn't budge. Every time Tom visited, Baxter would plant himself between him and my mom. If Tom moved closer, Baxter would let out that same eerie growl, eyes locked on him like he was the biggest threat in the world. We brushed it off. "Bax, stop being weird," Mom would scold. But he wasn't being weird. He was being right. Months later, Tom was arrested. I won't go into the details, but let's just say the charges against him were horrifying. The man my mom had been dating, the one we let into our home, wasn't just a bad guy. He was a monster. When we found out, I sat on the floor next to Baxter, scratching behind his ears as he nuzzled into me, calm and steady. He had known all along. Sometimes, the ones who love us the most see the truth before we do. But what happens when it's not a dog's instinct, but our own, that warns us of danger? Story number 14. My gut feeling about that creepy teacher was right. The narrator of this story, Jenna. When I was 13, I had this one teacher, Mr. Halloway. He was the kind of guy who always tried to be cool with the students, cracking jokes that never quite landed and acting like he was just one of us. But something about him always put me on edge. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. The way he always found an excuse to touch someone's shoulder, how he'd stand just a little too close when talking to us, or how his eyes lingered a second too long when girls wore skirts. I remember my best friend, Olivia, saying I was overreacting, that he was just awkward. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Then came the weirdest part. He always found reasons to keep certain girls after class. Sometimes for extra help, sometimes for a quick chat. I made sure I was never one of them. If I ever had a question, I'd ask in front of everyone or just Google it later. I never stayed alone with him, and I never let Olivia stay either. Years went by, and I forgot about Mr. Holloway. That is, until last year. I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw his face on a news article. He'd been arrested for possessing illegal material and for hiding a tiny camera in a pen he kept on his desk. My stomach dropped. All those times he had been writing notes, twirling that pen in his fingers, casually setting it down on students' desks. He had been filming. I don't know if he ever recorded me, but I do know one thing. I was right to trust my gut. Sometimes, your instincts aren't paranoia, they're protection. But what happens when your gut tells you something terrifying and it saves your life? Story number 15. The gut feeling that saved me from a mass shooting. The narrator of this story, Michael. College parties were my thing. Loud music, packed crowds, cheap beer, it was all part of the experience. That night was no different. It was the end of the semester, and the entire student body seemed to be crammed into one street, moving from house to house. The energy was electric, but for some reason, I felt off. I couldn't explain it. The people, the way they moved, the way they talked, something wasn't right. At first, I ignored it. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was overthinking. But the feeling wouldn't go away. My stomach twisted, my pulse sped up, and suddenly, I knew I had to leave. I grabbed my roommate, Eric, and a couple of friends. "Let's get out of here," I said. Eric laughed. "Dude, we just got here. I don't care. Something's wrong." They hesitated, but seeing the look on my face, they followed me. We pushed through the crowd, turned the corner, and started walking toward my car. Then it happened. Gunshots, screaming, chaos, people running in every direction. I turned back and saw people hitting the ground, ducking behind cars. Someone was shooting into the crowd. My body turned to ice. If we had stayed even 2 minutes longer, we would have been caught in it. Later, we found out 5 people died that night, with several others injured. The shooter was someone looking for revenge. Wrong place, wrong time for everyone there. I don't know what triggered my instincts that night, but I do know this. Sometimes, your gut isn't just a feeling, it's survival. But not all gut feelings are about life and death. Sometimes, they just tell you who's lying to you. Story number 16. I knew she was cheating before she even told me. The narrator of this story will. I've always believed that trust is the foundation of any relationship. But what happens when your gut tells you something's off, even when there's no proof? My girlfriend, Lauren, had been planning a 2-week camping trip with some friends from college. She was excited, and I was happy for her. But the moment she left, something felt wrong. It wasn't paranoia, and it wasn't jealousy. It was just a deep, nagging feeling in my chest that something wasn't right. At first, I ignored it. I told myself I was overthinking things. But as the days passed, our texts got shorter. The calls became less frequent. And when we did talk, something in her voice sounded forced, like she was holding something back. Then, the night before she was supposed to come home, my phone rang. "Hey," she said, her voice unusually soft. "We need to talk." And just like that, I knew. She didn't need to say the words. I already saw it coming. Lauren admitted she had met someone on the trip. "It just happened," she said. "I didn't plan for it." But I hung up before she could finish. A week later, a mutual friend confirmed what I already knew. She had been with this guy for most of the trip. While I had been sitting at home, questioning my instincts, she had been proving them right. I didn't have evidence. I didn't have texts or photos. But somehow, I knew before she even said a word. But not everyone gets the chance to discover the truth in time. Sometimes, gut feelings are the only thing standing between you and real danger. Story number 17. The stranger in the camper van. The narrator of this story, Julie. When I was 13, my best friend Hannah and I were on a camping trip with my family. One afternoon, as we walked back to our tent, we passed by a camper van parked near the edge of the campground. A man in his 40s stood outside. He looked at us and said something about coming over for a drink, maybe soda or water. Hannah hesitated, but I felt something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but my stomach dropped. A wave of panic hit me out of nowhere. Every part of me screamed, "Leave now." I grabbed Hannah's wrist and pulled her away, mumbling a quick excuse. The man called after us, but we kept walking faster this time. Years later, I came across a news article. That same man had been arrested. I don't remember his exact words that day, or even what he looked like in detail, but I remember the feeling. And looking back, I know that if we had walked over to that van, we might never have walked away. If something feels off, trust your instincts. You don't need proof. You don't need a reason. Just leave. But sometimes, a gut feeling isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about saving someone else. Story number 18. The message that saved a life. The narrator of this story, Caradoc. It had been a few weeks since I last talked to Emily. We were good friends in college, but after graduation, life got in the way. We texted here and there, but nothing consistent. Then, one random evening, as I was scrolling through my phone, her name popped into my head. There was no reason for it. We hadn't spoken in weeks. But something inside me, something I couldn't explain, told me to reach out. I hesitated for a second. Would it be weird? Would she even reply? But I shrugged and sent a simple text. Hey Em, long time no talk. Have you been? She answered surprisingly fast. We ended up talking for hours. About life, about work, about stupid memes we used to send each other. Nothing deep, nothing groundbreaking. Just two old friends catching up. I didn't think much of it after that. Until a month later, out of the blue, she sent me a long message. She told me that on the night I texted her, she had been at her lowest. She had been sitting alone, convinced that no one cared, convinced that she was completely alone. And then her phone lit up with my message. She told me that it saved her life. I was speechless. All I did was send a text. A simple, meaningless, hey, how are you? But to her, it wasn't meaningless at all. That night, I realized something. You never know what someone else is going through. You never know how much a small act of kindness, a text, a call, a simple check-in can mean to someone. So if you ever feel like reaching out to someone, even for no reason at all, do it. It might be nothing, or it might just save a life. But sometimes, a gut feeling doesn't lead to reconnecting with an old friend. Sometimes, it warns you about the people you should stay far away from. Story number 19. The professor I knew to avoid. The narrator of this story, Amelinda. From the very first class, something felt off about Professor Albert. I couldn't explain it. He wasn't outwardly creepy. He was charismatic, friendly, and always made jokes to seem approachable. But there was something in the way he looked at me, something in the way he lingered too long when I asked a question, something in the way he seemed a little too invested in certain students. Still, I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was overthinking. Then, the invitation started. You should stop by my office hours. We can go over the material in private. If you ever need extra credit, come see me after class. You don't have to email me. Just swing by my office. I'll always make time for you. Maybe he was just helpful. Maybe I was being paranoid. But that feeling in my gut, the one that had been nagging at me since the first day, screamed at me to stay away. So I did. I never went to his office alone. If I had a question, I'd ask in class or with a group. Then, months later, I saw his name in the news. A female student had come forward, accusing him of assaulting her during one of those private meetings in his office. More students followed, sharing similar experiences. The university had ignored complaints for years, until it finally blew up. I sat there, staring at the screen, a sick feeling in my stomach. I had been right. I had no proof, no evidence, just a gut instinct. And that instinct saved me from becoming another one of his victims. But not all gut feelings are warnings about danger. Sometimes, they connect us to something much deeper, something we can't explain. Story number 20. The night I felt my best friend leave. The narrator of this story, Gilbert. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in omens, spirits, or any of that supernatural stuff. But that night, something happened that I can't explain. I was sitting at my desk, playing online with a few friends, when suddenly, a wave of cold dread ran down my spine. My hands stopped moving. My breath hitched. It was like the air in the room had shifted, turning heavy and thick, like something was pressing down on me. I tried to shake it off. Just a weird moment, right? Maybe I was tired, but the feeling didn't leave. It sat there, clawing at my chest. Something was wrong. I barely played the rest of the game. My mind felt elsewhere, though I couldn't tell you where. I just knew something had happened. Then, about an hour later, my phone rang. It was my friend's sister, and before she even said a word, I already knew. He was gone. A car accident. Quick, unexpected. One moment he was there, the next he wasn't. I sat in silence, gripping my phone, staring at the screen. How'd I felt it? Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it was nothing. Or maybe some part of me just knew. But not all instincts are about loss. Sometimes, they're about sensing the danger that's right in front of you. Story number 21. The supermarket creep. The narrator of this story, Juliana. It was just another grocery run. A quick stop to grab a few things before heading home. But as I walked through the aisles, something felt off. I noticed a guy wandering aimlessly. No cart, no basket, just strolling. At first, I thought he might be waiting for someone, but he wasn't looking around like a person expecting a friend. He was scanning. That's when I saw it. He stopped near the gift card section, where a woman in workout clothes was crouched down, flipping through the racks. As she focused on picking a card, he pulled out his phone, angled it downward, and snapped a photo. What the hell? I froze for a second. Did I just imagine that? But then he did it again. I felt my stomach twist. I wasn't sure what his deal was, but I knew one thing. This was wrong. I walked straight to the nearest cashier and quietly asked if there was security in the store. She nodded and called someone over. While waiting, I spotted the guy again, now pretending to look at bags of chips, but his phone was still out. When security arrived, I pointed him out and explained what I saw. They didn't hesitate. One guard stayed with me while another followed the guy. Moments later, I saw them pull him aside near the entrance. A few minutes later, one of the guards came back and shook his head. Good call. Man, he muttered. His phone is filled with these. My stomach dropped. Not just one or two photos, hundreds. I don't know what happened after that. I didn't stick around to find out. But I left that store with one lesson burned into my mind. Creeps don't always look like creeps. But your instincts? They always know. But sometimes, it's not about a stranger in a store. Sometimes, it's a gut feeling that tells you the people around your child aren't as safe as they seem. Top of form, bottom of form. Story number 22, The Preschool Nightmare. The narrator of this story, Susan. The moment I stepped into that preschool, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The place looked clean enough. The classrooms had bright posters, little tables, and shelves filled with books. But the energy was wrong. The teacher barely acknowledged me when we walked in. Her expression was blank, distant, like she was just enduring her job rather than enjoying it. She introduced herself quickly, never smiled, and moved on as if we were an inconvenience. Then I noticed the kids. They weren't playing or talking much. A few of them clung to each other, glancing at the teacher like they were waiting for something bad to happen. One little boy accidentally knocked over a plastic divider, and instead of reassuring him, the teacher rolled her eyes and ignored his tears. A red flag. Still, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe it was just a rough day. So, I signed my daughter up for a trial week. Biggest mistake of my life. The first day went okay. Mostly because there were other staff around, and my daughter was too shy to interact much. But on day 2, I arrived earlier than expected for pickup. And that's when I saw it. The teacher was standing over a group of kids, barking orders. Then, out of nowhere, she grabbed my daughter's arm and yanked her back into line. I froze, and then I heard her hiss. Stop being so difficult. You're all little brats. That was it. I stormed in, scooped up my daughter, and walked straight to the front office to withdraw her on the spot. The worst part? I kept thinking about all the other kids. Kids whose parents didn't see what I saw. Kids who couldn't tell their parents what was happening. I still feel guilty that I couldn't do more. But I'll never ignore my instincts again. Because sometimes, a gut feeling doesn't just protect your child. It saves their life. Story number 23. The Lunch That Saved Grandma. The narrator of this story, Emmy. When I was 8 years old, I had one of those stubborn, won't take no for an answer moments. It was a Saturday morning, and my grandma, Nana Ruth, was at our house, sipping her tea and working on a crossword puzzle. I suddenly had this overwhelming urge to take her out to lunch. Not just a casual suggestion, a full-blown obsession. Nana, let's go to Benny's Diner. I pleaded. We haven't been in forever. She chuckled, shaking her head. Not today, sweetheart. I'm feeling a little tired, but I wouldn't let it go. I whined. I pouted. I even pulled out the ultimate weapon, the sad puppy eyes. Finally, after what felt like a century of convincing, she sighed. All right, you're relentless. So off we went to Benny's, just me, my dad, and Nana. We had barely placed our order when I noticed something strange. Nana suddenly stopped talking mid-sentence. Her words became garbled, slurred. Then her right hand dropped her fork like she couldn't hold on to it. Dad and I looked at each other. Something was wrong. Within seconds, he was on his feet, waving down a server. Call 911. Now, everything after that was a blur. The ambulance, the paramedics, the hospital. But one thing was crystal clear. Nana was having a stroke. Later that day, the doctor told us something that still haunts me to this day. If she had arrived even 15 minutes later, she might not have made it. I was just a kid. I had no idea why I felt so strongly about going to that diner. But somehow, deep down, I knew. Sometimes, a gut feeling isn't just a feeling, it's a lifesaver. Story number 24. The Photograph That Almost Disappeared. The narrator of this story, Matthew. Cleaning days are the worst. You start off full of energy, determined to organize your life. But by hour 3, you're sitting on the floor, lost in a pile of old memories. That's exactly where I was. half buried under a mountain of dusty newspapers and forgotten junk in my mom's attic. When I found the photograph, it wasn't a normal photo. It was a grainy, yellowed newspaper clipping with an old black and white picture of a political event from decades ago. It looked completely irrelevant, just a bunch of people in suits shaking hands. I almost tossed it into the trash pile. Almost, but something made me stop. A weird feeling, like I needed to look at it again. So instead of throwing it away, I tucked it into my pocket. Later that evening, as I was showing my mom and grandma some of the random things I found, I casually pulled out the clipping. "Look at this old thing," I said, handing it to them. The moment my grandma saw it, she froze. Her hand went to her mouth, and she let out a small gasp. That's him," she whispered. I frowned. "Who?" She turned the clipping around, tapping her finger on one of the men in the background, a man I had never met. "My father," she said, voice shaking. "That's your great-grandfather." I felt a chill run down my spine. Turns out, there were almost no surviving pictures of him. The few they had were lost over the years. And yet, here he was, captured by pure chance in the background of an old newspaper photo that I had almost thrown away. Sometimes, your gut feeling isn't about danger. It's about holding on to something before it's gone forever. Story number 25. The Roommate Who Never Came Out. The narrator of this story, Paul. Finding a roommate is like playing the world's worst lottery. You either hit the jackpot with someone chill, or you end up with a guy who leaves dishes in the sink until they become a biohazard. When I got a new roommate, Adrian, he seemed like an okay guy. Quiet, polite, kept to himself. We had maybe 2 real conversations, one about the best pizza place nearby, and another where he asked if I liked hiking. That was it. Then, he disappeared. At first, I didn't think much of it. Some people just like staying in their rooms, right? But after 3 days of silence, no footsteps, no bathroom trips, I got this sinking feeling. Something was wrong. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. A tiny voice in my head whispered, "Don't open the door. Don't be the one to find him." But I knew I couldn't ignore it. So I called the landlord, who called the police. When they arrived and broke in, I already knew what they were going to find. Adrian had been gone for days. The officers asked me if I knew anything about him, his family, friends, problems. I had nothing. Just those 2 conversations. 2 little pieces of a life that ended too soon. But not every gut feeling warns of danger. Sometimes, it leads you to something truly life-changing. Story number 26. The Concert That Changed Everything. The narrator of this story, David. Some decisions in life feel random, like picking a new restaurant, watching a show on a whim, or buying a concert ticket for no reason. But every now and then, those little choices change everything. It started when I heard on the radio that U2 was coming to town. Now, I like their music, sure, but I wasn't a diehard fan. Still, something in me screamed that I had to go. Not wanted to go, needed to. It was bizarre. I'd never felt this way about any concert before, so I bought a ticket. Then, as if fate was playing tricks on me, my friend who was supposed to come along bailed last minute. That left me with an extra ticket and no one to go with. I could have just sold it, but instead, I decided to post online, offering it to anyone who wanted it. Enter Lena. She was a huge U2 fan, had missed out on getting tickets, and jumped at the chance to go. We met outside the venue. Her excited, me just happy the ticket didn't go to waste. And then the concert started. Between songs, we talked, and talked, and talked. On the ride home, while others dozed off in the car, we stayed awake, sharing stories, laughing, realizing we had way too much in common. A few months later, I asked her out. A year after that, I asked her to marry me. And now, 24 years, 2 kids, and a dog later, I still think about that one little decision. Buying a ticket to a concert I wasn't even that excited about. Sometimes, the gut feeling that leads you somewhere isn't about danger, but about finding exactly where you're meant to be. Story number 27. Leaving summer camp just in time. The narrator of this story, Tom. When you're a kid, adults always assume you're being dramatic. Stomachache? Probably just nerves. Feeling off? It's all in your head. But what if it isn't? I was 11 years old when my parents dropped me off at summer camp. It was supposed to be an exciting week, canoeing, campfires, making new friends. But the moment we pulled up, something felt wrong. It hit me like a wave, the kind of unease that makes your skin crawl. My stomach twisted into knots, and a headache pounded at my temples. I felt physically sick. Maybe it's just nerves, my dad said, patting my back. My mom handed me a water bottle and told me to give it a try, but the feeling didn't go away. I begged them, actually begged, to take me home. I didn't care if it made me look like a baby. I needed to leave. After a few more pleas, and maybe some dramatic sniffles for effect. My mom finally sighed and looked at my dad. I don't know. If he's this upset, maybe we should just take him back. Dad wasn't thrilled, but he gave in. That night, as I lay safe in my bed, a massive storm ripped through the camp. Tents were shredded. Trees snapped like twigs. The dining hall flooded. The very spot where I would have been sleeping was completely destroyed. The next morning, my parents stared at the news in shock. Looks like we made the right call, Dad muttered. I don't know what made me so certain I couldn't stay, but I do know one thing: sometimes trusting your gut is the smartest thing you can do. But not every gut feeling is about danger. Sometimes it's about the people around you. Those who seem normal but hide something much darker. Story number 28. The Cruel Stepmother. The narrator of this story, Elisa. I met Lisa's stepmother, Carol, for the first time when we were teenagers. From the moment she shook my hand, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious. She was polite, smiled at all the right moments. But there was something in her eyes, something cold. I brushed it off. Maybe I was being judgmental. Over the years, I started noticing little things. Lisa never wanted to go home. She'd stay at my place as late as possible, coming up with excuses to avoid leaving. When she did talk about home, her stories were filled with tension, like how Carol always found a reason to blame her for things she didn't do. Once, Lisa told me Carol accused her of breaking a vase that had been shattered before she even got home from school. I swear, she looked me in the eye and told me I did it, Lisa said, laughing it off, but I could tell it bothered her. One day, Lisa came over unusually quiet, her eyes red like she'd been crying. When I asked, she hesitated before finally admitting. She threw a plate at me. I thought she was exaggerating. Maybe Carol had dropped something in anger. But Lisa shook her head. No, she aimed it at me. That was the first time I realized this wasn't just some strict stepmom. This was something worse. I never witnessed Carol's full cruelty firsthand, but I saw the effects. Lisa became more withdrawn, more anxious. Her little brother barely spoke around adults. I once overheard Carol snapping at him, her voice dripping with venom, and the way he flinched told me everything I needed to know. Eventually, Lisa cut ties with all of us. She said she needed to leave everything behind, including the friends who reminded her of that house. I wish I had done more, said something, but back then, I was just a kid too. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut. It told me something was wrong from the very start. And as we've seen throughout these stories, sometimes that instinct is the only thing standing between us and disaster. We've just gone through 28 incredible stories, from near misses with danger to life-changing moments, all guided by nothing more than a gut feeling. Some were terrifying, others heartwarming, but one thing's for sure: intuition is a powerful thing. So, what about you? Have you ever had a strong gut feeling that turned out to be right? Do you believe in intuition? Or do you think it's all just coincidence? Let me know in the comments. And if you love hearing true, spine-chilling stories like these, subscribe to Reddit True Vault so you never miss out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.